Yes, welcome into the camp. Just a few days out from game number one. Badgers in Western Michigan get a face-off on Friday night at Camp Randall Stadium. Jesse, as Luke Fickell said, this was the longest week of the season for his program. Does it feel that same way for you?
No, I think I've had longer weeks. Maybe part of it is that the game is on Friday, and so we don't have to wait as long. But I certainly understand it from a player and coaching perspective when you spend all this time trying to get ready for the opener and you're just itching to finally get there.
Yeah, and they'll get there again 8 o'clock. So it's not even like, oh, yay, I get to wake up at 11 a.m. and play a game. No, I got to wait all day Friday, and not even just a 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, but an 8 o'clock game. The people that are very excited about that, though, are the students and the fans who, I guess, if maybe fans aren't overly excited, but I'm sure the students are. They get a little extra time to prepare, but they also get to drink in the stadium this year, too. Luke Fickell was asked about that yesterday. He said, "Oh, yeah, it doesn't really matter," but I think it does matter to try and potentially get a certain group of fans into the stadium earlier.
If it helps create a better atmosphere, then obviously everyone in the program will take it because that's an advantage for the Badgers.
Yeah, so we're going to get into the depth chart that was released yesterday. Going to talk a little bit about the college football playoff and its impact on Wisconsin through Luke Fickell's comments to your question. So, and we're going to get into a few other things, coaching tiers maybe. We'll see. Before we get there, though, obviously wanted to mention that Home Field is the official apparel sponsor of the camp, and they've got their Can't Miss kickoff campaign still going on here as week one approaches. They've got these platinum football boxes that have these 3 new designs for Wisconsin in them, and also a really cool hat and some other things in there. So check them out at homefield.com. Best retro gear that you can possibly find for the Badgers, and you can find more information up on homefield.com and use the promo code Bucky24 for 15% off your first purchase. Also, before we get into this, got a pair of tickets for Friday night's game up for grabs. Great seats, 40-yard line, 51 rows up. Going to be under the overhang near the aisle. They got padded seats for your butt. All you got to do to get them is a couple of things. One, you actually have to use them. I don't want to give them away to somebody that's not actually going to use them. 2, you got to follow our Instagram account, the camp's Instagram account, which is the camp_Wisconsin. And then you got to answer a trivia question that I'll ask you at some point during the show today. And then you'll just shoot us a message on Instagram with the answer. I'll go through all the correct answers and announce winner on Thursday's show. It's not going to be a hard question. Anyone that listens to us on a regular basis will get it very easily. Even if you don't listen, it's still very obvious. And again, Jesse, if I forget about it, please remind me at some point here. It's a very, very easy question. So we'll get into that. But let's start with the depth chart that Wisconsin released on Monday, the week one depth chart. I know you wrote about it. I look at the depth chart and say a lot of this makes sense, but there were a few things that maybe stood out, certainly for you, right?
Yeah, the most obvious, and we knew this was coming, is James Thompson Jr. is out for potentially the season based on what Luke Fickell said. Had surgery last week. Luke said could be 4 or 5 months in terms of the recovery process. And as a result, it's reflected on the depth chart. So that is a huge blow for Wisconsin just because of the experience and what he had accomplished on the field. So we've got Ben Barton filling that role now alongside Kurt Neal, and the backups are listed as Cade McDonald and Elijah Hills, but certainly Brandon Lane, the Stephen F. Austin transfer, will be a part of that rotation. And we talked to Luke about this as well. Who else could be included? Which we can get into when we discuss some of the other freshmen. Dylan Johnson could be in there as well. But that is notable just in general because of what it means for the outlook of this defense. And in particular, the defensive line, which was already, to me, one of the biggest questions in terms of position groups coming into the season.
I mean, it's far and away still if it wasn't the biggest question at this point, it certainly is now. Like when we're coming out of fall camp and fall camp closed, they had made progress. Luke Fickell even said it, right? They said they had made some progress there, but losing James Thompson Jr. is just so significant. And I had questions myself of whether they were able to continue to be able to, or get back to being able to stop the run the way they did at earlier not even earlier, like under Jim Leonard and Wilcox and Aranda, and they just didn't stop the run well last year. And needing a stout defensive line is kind of where it starts, and that's a huge question now. It's a huge question. So I don't know if they'll be tested significantly on Friday night against Western Michigan. We don't know a ton about Western Michigan at this point, just because of some newness on both sides of the ball. But they're going to be certainly tested September 14th, and I guess we'll see if they're ready. That's the one spot you couldn't lose. We talked. Luke Fickell said it last year. Where couldn't they lose guys? Quarterback and running back. Where'd they lose guys? Quarterback and running back. Where couldn't they lose guys this year? Defensive line, and I don't know what other position you want to include in that, but defensive line. Couldn't lose defensive linemen, and that's exactly what happened. So unfortunate. The other aspect of the depth chart that's not a surprise, but it also kind of makes me question or wonder exactly what it's going to look like, and that is Chez Mellusi listed as number 1 running back and Tawee Walker listed as the number 2 running back. I'm wondering for you, what does carry distribution in week 1 look like?
For week 1, I imagine it'll be pretty close. As long as Chez is healthy, to me, he was going to be the starter based on what he has earned here. It's not like he's a worse player now, even though I know we spent a lot of time in the spring and in the preseason talking about what Tawee Walker could provide. I think the distribution will be pretty close. And it's hard to say exactly what that looks like because I don't know what the ratio of run pass is going to be in a matchup like this when we know very little about Western Michigan and what's going to work and what will work for this offense. But even if it's like 18 carries for Chez and 15 for Tawee, I just think it's going to be, you start the season thinking it's pretty close. And if one of them consistently emerges, then it can shift, which we've certainly seen over the years at Wisconsin.
We have, what does it look like behind them?
Yeah. I don't know how many carry opportunities there are going to be. I do think early in this season is a real opportunity to try and get some other players in there. Jackson Akers still is probably the number 3 running back, but I'd like to see what the 2 freshmen can do, just because how many chances are you really going to have in a game that potentially is out of hand in the second half, so you don't have a lot to lose, and you want to see what those players can do. But I just think the vast majority of the carries are going to be those top 2 guys, unless or until it gets out of hand.
Are you confident that it's going to get out of hand? I guess we don't need to get in that. We'll get into that. We'll get into that on Thursday. We'll make our picks on Thursday. But I mean, again, last year's non-conference games were not necessarily out of hand very early, right? It took a little bit. So that's why I say that. Wide receiver is, I don't know that it was a surprise just because when we last saw practice, he was running with the 2s, but Chris Brooks in the 2 deep. How many wide receivers do you think will play?
Right now, I'm confident in 5, and I think the rest has to be earned. Obviously, you're looking at the depth chart. The reason they've got 7 wide receivers in there is because they have an or separating Vinny Anthony and CJ Williams. And both those guys are going to play, and maybe they just rotate snaps on the other side opposite Bryson Green. We've spent a lot of time talking about Will Pauling and Tretch Kekahuna. The Quincy Burrows one is interesting because the last couple of weeks we did not see him out there. He had a brace on his knee, and so if he's healthy, I think he was trending toward playing. I don't necessarily see them playing 7 guys, but we've said Chris Brooks Jr. offers something a little bit different. 6'2", 218 pounds, a big body who can go win 50-50 balls. I don't think it's realistic to think you're going to see 7. So I would say I'm confident that the number is 5 to start with. And if Quincy Burrows or Chris Brooks Jr. can work their way in there, then maybe there's room for a 6. But remember what happened last year. Keontez Lewis was on the outside looking in as the number 6. And, well, he didn't make it past 2 weeks into the season. I'm not saying that's going to happen this year, but it just goes to show you that what you think may not be what happens because there's not enough to go around.
Again, I know why he made that decision. I certainly understand it. Didn't want to play the 4 games so that he could keep keep the red shirt, but he could have been used at some point last year. They needed a deep threat. They needed, eventually Phil Longo would have, you think eventually Phil Longo would have gone to him. I don't know. We don't need to rehash last year at all, but that was talking about poor choices. I think that was a poor choice on Keontez Lewis's part, but it is what it is. Offensive line real quickly. Barrett Nelson, the backup at left tackle. Kevin Haywood, the backup at right tackle. I don't know. Again, this is an unofficial depth chart, so I don't want to put too much onto it. We didn't see a ton of that in fall camp. Usually it was Haywood at left tackle, Merritt Nelson at right tackle.
Yeah, I thought we would see two other freshmen in there, but obviously if Barrett Nelson is healthy, he's probably your top reserve option at tackle. What we did see a lot in camp was Colin Cubberly at right guard, Everson Mandel at right tackle, and Kevin Haywood at left tackle. Now, Kevin did play a little right tackle with the first team unit when Riley Mallman was sidelined with an injury. This is a depth chart that seems to just side with guys that are veterans, putting James Durand in there as well as a backup left guard. But that doesn't necessarily mean there won't be a couple freshmen who can work their way in. On the other hand, it's a depth chart that feels reasonable for where we're at right now.
Yeah, I would agree. All right, going to the other side of the ball. This was something I thought that was a possibility just because of what we saw towards the end of our time at camp, and that was Preston Zachman with the starting group.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that he got time with him, and Austin Brown is going to play a ton as well, but what does a rotation back there look like, especially because we don't know exactly where Kamoi Latu is injury-wise?
Well, it's tough to take Hunter Wohler off the field for starters because of what he means to this defense. And so if that's the case, then you wonder where the other snap's going to come from. I can see a situation where Zachman and Austin Brown are rotating a little bit. And Zachman definitely came on strong this preseason, had a day where he had a couple interceptions. When Luke was talking about this on Monday, he said it was tough for Alex Grinch. She was coming in this offseason. Spring practices are starting, doesn't know much about this team. Preston Zachman is not participating at all because he's coming off an offseason hip injury or surgery. And so you had to wait your turn a little bit, but he does have experience. He played in every game a year ago. He had 5 starts. I think the good news for Wisconsin is that whoever's out there from a rotational perspective, you've got a lot of experience and a group you can feel confident in. I don't necessarily know where Kamoi Latu fits in when healthy. We know how physical he is, but you want guys who are going to be sure tacklers, and maybe some of those other players have demonstrated they have done that on a more consistent basis. The other thing Luke said is not only are they planning to rotate, but there are going to be some situations where they might have additional safeties on the field depending on various packages. So I think it's an opportunity to get more of those players on the field. I do think, though, that you got to go into the season feeling pretty good about the safety group as a whole.
He's not a safety, but he is a guy that really obviously came on in spring and fall camp. That's Max Lofi. And I know a lot of people are probably interested to see what exactly he looks like. I know Luke Fickell, I think we've hammered home the idea that Nazir Forkarine, we've said it a ton. Luke Fickell said he was the most improved guy from the end of the season to spring ball. He has a new guy in terms of who's improved the most, and that's Max Lofi.
I think that's the highest praise that he can give somebody. And obviously it means you're starting from a little bit lower level or a space where the coaching staff has questions about you. But Luke's been pretty open and honest about this, even dating to the spring. And he reiterated it Monday that Max was just in a position where maybe it's on the fence about what his status with this program is going to be moving forward. It's tough. It's not his fault because he had an ankle injury that he sustained late in the 2022 season, but it kept him out last year. And there's an entirely new coaching staff who's trying to figure out who they can roll with moving forward. And they know absolutely nothing about Max Lofi. And so Max deserves a lot of credit for sticking with it, for keeping his mouth shut and showing up, and then demonstrating when he got his opportunity in spring ball why he deserves to be out there. And that's part of why Austin Brown, at least at this point, is listed as a backup, though he's going to play a ton, because Max was good enough that they felt confident to put him in there as the starting nickel corner. I still think if they have to have another guy in there, it'll be Austin Brown, even though the backup for the nickel spot is right now Owen Arnett. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who have seen a little bit of Lofi, but in this kind of role, it's going to be big for him.
Yeah, and I think they also, when you're going to get spread out, and they go to their version of what the dollar package is going to look like this year, and they're bringing on another DB, like could Austin Brown be in the slot, or is that going to be RJ Delancey too? Because we saw that at the end of fall camp. I'm interested to see exactly what happens when teams do spread them out and they do have the 6 DBs on the field and how they work about that. But I'm also intrigued by a number of different formations that we saw in fall camp and exactly how they decide to deploy those and when they decide to deploy those. Namely, the one defensive lineman with his hand on the ground package. So we'll see on that. 2 true freshmen in the 2 deep, right? Did I count that correctly?
That is right.
Xavier Lucas and obviously Kevin Haywood, who we already talked about. Xavier Lucas, I think I did bold prediction. I think he ends up, a starter at some point this year. How many true freshmen end up playing, do you think?
Well, as of now on the depth chart, they've got Lucas separated by an or. I believe it's with RJ Delancey at one of the backup corner spots. And then the other backup cornerback spot is either Delancey or Jonas DeClona. But I'm with you. I think Lucas is going to emerge and get a lot of time. I would say you have to mention the two freshmen, Darian Dupree, Dylan Jones. If Thomas Heiberger is healthy, at least based on what Matt Mitchell said, he was at a point where he feels like he has earned the right to be out there. So I think he would be one of those guys. That puts us at what? If Kevin Haywood's in there, 5. And beyond that, Dylan Johnson now has to be in the conversation. I mean, Luke said it himself. He said he's for sure going to play as a true freshman, although I don't know what for sure means in terms of a snap count when you've still got Brandon Lane in there, who's going to be ahead of him as your potential number 5. But that's a half dozen true freshmen, and I'm not ruling out the possibility of one or two others potentially emerging from what is an incredibly talented class.
Who could some of those guys be, you think?
That could be
like emerging, like later on, like a Trechka Kahuna type of thing, where he comes on late in the season, and perhaps it's at that same position.
Yeah, Kyan Barry Johnson would be one, just because of what we saw this preseason, where he looks every bit as qualified to be able to make plays in space. But I think that's largely, it would be a result of one of the top 2 guys not being available in my mind, because those two are far and away the top 2 slot receivers. But there are at least a handful of freshmen from what we saw that when they're in there, they make plays at a level that make you believe they could contribute this year. Some of it comes down to opportunity and who's ahead of you, though.
One more thing before we move on from the depth chart. Sebastian Cheeks is someone who was kind of, I won't say buried at inside linebacker, but was behind he was not a part of the top 5 group, right? Like he was not somebody that was in line for a lot of playing time. And now in this depth chart, he is at least in the 2 deep. Now they listed 2 guys with the first team, right? Or 3 guys with the first team with Peterson. And then it was John Pius or Lowry. But I think Sebastian Cheeks, the injury to Thomas Heiberger, the injury to Aaron Witt allowed Sebastian Cheeks time. And it sounds like that may be a permanent move and one that may work out great for him.
Yeah, with those top 3 that they have listed as starters or co-starters, they have the backups as Aaron Witt at one spot and Sebastian Cheeks at the other. And I think we talked about this in the preseason, especially into that 3rd week once they made the switch. I really felt like Cheeks was going to have a role because he was consistently showing up and making plays. And I think that's still going to be the case. Luke certainly speaks very highly of him. The fact that he was able to do that in such a short period of time speaks to that athletic ability that he has and some of those natural instincts. And I think the more opportunities he has, even in practice, to play that position, the better he can be. But it does feel like that's a better fit for him, especially when you consider who else they have at inside linebacker right now. They're pretty well set, at least for this season, with that top 4 of Jake Chaney, Jaheim Thomas, Tackett Curtis, and Christian Allegro.
They definitely are. And Fickell said as much, like the outside linebackers, you look at some of the body types, Sebastian's a little bit different. He's a little bit smaller, but he potentially could bring a little bit different pass rushing ability that might look a little bit different than the guys that they have there already. All right. Does anything else stand out to you on the depth chart, or are we good?
I think we pretty well covered it. I think there's 21 seniors in the 2 deep on offense and defense. So there's a lot of veteran guys here. And what I also thought was interesting in general is how many players are part of that 2 deep and special teams too that were on the previous staff. Like there's a lot of players that this current staff is banking on, of guys that were Paul Chryst guys. And I just think that's interesting, but that's part of the natural transition.
Well, I mean, the guys that they wanted and the guys that are important are still here, and the ones that aren't are not. Yes. Right? I mean, outside of defensive line, right? Like, could they have used a Gio Paez? Could they have used a Rodas Johnson? Right? Like those are 2 guys that they probably would have been okay with coming back. Again, here's the thing. I know there's been a lot of the hand-wringing about that. Oh, they ended up going to SEC schools. Rodas Johnson's like in a timeshare as a backup with a younger guy. Gio Paez is one that I think certainly Rodas Johnson is what it is. Gio Paez is a starter for LSU. LSU's defense was horrible last year. Horrible. like just really, really bad. So it's awesome that he's down there and they got a shot, but they, like Wisconsin, offered a ton of guys in the portal trying to find someone, and Gio was a very, very late ad for them. But you go around and look at some of the guys that left, like Nolan Rucci, I think is like a co-starter with, or maybe even like competing with a younger guy for a starting spot. Logan Brown is a starter, finally, over at Kansas. Like, I'm just thinking of some of the guys that left. Trey Wettig, I think, is a starter at Indiana. Which of those guys or any of those guys would have helped Wisconsin, like actually as a starter on this team? Gio Paez? And I guess Rodas, if he was still here?
Potentially, just where they are from a depth and experience perspective along the defensive line. That's why guys like Trey and Nolan left, because they weren't going to be necessarily a starter this season. But they would have helped add depth. You can't blame anybody for leaving for a better opportunity.
No, it all made sense. And Chimere Dike down at Florida, he's probably going to be a bigger part of that offense because Graham Mertz obviously trusts him. But I don't know that I would add Chimere back into this team either. I think he kind of showed last year that maybe this wasn't the greatest fit for him or something to that extent. And he may have a great year down at Florida. Skylar Bell may have a great year at UConn. Same thing with Nick Evers. They may tear it up. But the guys that are actually on the field for Wisconsin at this point, when I look at it and I say they're better off right now than they were last year.
Yeah.
So
another thing of note, I believe of the 15 scholarship transfers they brought in, 11 are in the 2 deep there. And that includes special teams, because I'm including Tyrell Henry, who's listed as the starting returner. But so that at least says something about you're going to get guys that you want to be impact playmakers, and they are, and the handful that aren't. I mean, that includes Leighton Nelson, who presumably would have been a part of the rotation in some fashion, but suffered an injury. I think some people looked at that depth chart and said, oh my goodness, they brought in 2 transfer wide receivers, and neither of them are listed in the 2 deep. Yeah, that is true. Probably the biggest surprise to me is just where Joseph Griffin is at right now relative to where I thought he would be based on the numbers that he put up at Boston College. But I think that also says something about the other guys they feel good about and how challenging it can be to make an impact right away.
Did Tretch Kekahuna get even faster? You don't know what I'm asking here, do you?
I don't.
What number is he now?
Oh, you mean because he's a single-digit guy and they flipped? Well, I know in your mind that probably shaves, what, 1/10 of a second on the 40?
At least 3/10, because it's the 2. 2 is, there's no more revered number at Wisconsin, at least in my opinion, than number 2. So when you think about the history of it, Lita Ramus, obviously Jamar Fletcher, Brian Calhoun, Scott Starks, Jonathan Casillas, Joel Stave, go on down the list of the greats at Wisconsin, and a lot of them wore number 2. And so Tretch Kekahuna getting number 2 and Joseph Griffin being moved to 12, I think kind of says what needs to be said about that, about where Joseph Griffin is. Again, I think he has a chance to help them, but the injury, I think, kind of put him back a little bit. He didn't get to take part as much in fall camp as he, probably wanted to, but that because he wasn't here for the spring, he needed all that time in fall camp, and he just didn't get it. And Chris Brooks took advantage of his absence, and I think the absence of Quincy Burrows as well. So, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Did you want to go through special teams real quickly, or are we good? Nathaniel Wakos is the kicker. He's not. It doesn't sound like he's going to do the kickoffs. So that at least Gavin Lom was listed there.
It went about the way we thought it was going to go because they have Vinny Anthony handling the kickoffs and Tyrell Henry handling the punts, and Tretch is listed as the backup for both of them, which we talked about toward the end of the open practices this preseason. It felt like it was trending in that direction, in part because you got to be able to take care of the ball, and it's not a bad option to have both those guys because they both have starting experience. Henry handled the kick and punts for 2 seasons at Michigan State, so that's probably as much as needs to be said about special teams at this point.
All right. As promised, we are going to give away some tickets to the Western Michigan game coming up on Friday night. And the trivia question is quite easy. Just a reminder, however, all you have to do is go to our Instagram, follow it, the camp_Wisconsin, and answer the trivia question. Send me a direct message, and I will go through all the correct answers and then pick a name and then announce that on Thursday. So here is the here's the trivia question. It's who is the most insufferable head coach in the Big Ten? It's a very simple one. There's only one answer. And if you get it right, got a chance for these really nice tickets coming up here on Friday night. So again, just go to our Instagram, answer that question. Who is the most insufferable coach in the Big Ten? Anybody that's listening to the show or knows me knows exactly who I'm talking about. And if you do, send that to the Instagram. And again, pick names on before Thursday's show. All right, let's transition. One of the questions that was asked to Luke Fickell yesterday was about the impact of the 12-team playoff. I believe that came from you. Is that accurate? What kind of impact does it have on Wisconsin? Because I thought it was essentially, not essentially, it was interesting to hear Luke Fickell talk about Week 3 and that Week 3 game not necessarily being a season ender if you were to lose it. I don't know that I was a huge fan of that messaging, but it is what it is. I think the playoff allows you to have errors and make mistakes and have games that don't go your way early in a season because you have a little bit of margin for error.
I'm okay with what he said because it's the reality of the situation. It's not like he's going to be preaching to the team. Now, if we lose this, we're going to be
But it's already in his mind. It's already in his mind. He's already saying it.
But I asked this question because it's a story that I'm working on. Like, what is Wisconsin's place in the 12-team college football playoff field? We saw what it was like in a 14 field. You had to basically put together the perfect season or pretty damn close, and close often wasn't good enough. The thing about it is, if you go back to the BCS era, which started in 1998, I believe the Badgers would have qualified for a 12-team playoff 8 times. And yes, none of those were in the last 4 seasons. They've been trending in the wrong direction, but it just tells you about what level Wisconsin achieved, and it still wasn't quite enough to break into that upper echelon. And now with a 12-team playoff, it opens the door in a unique way, especially for a program like Wisconsin, because in my mind, what it means is, okay, we don't have divisions anymore in the Big Ten, but if you are a Wisconsin, you don't have to win the Big Ten. You don't even have to play for the Big Ten championship. And that may not be the messaging that people want to hear, but it's also the reality that you can be just kind of good enough and hang out there and get a couple big wins, but maybe not the biggest win, and you still have a chance. It makes it more exciting for college football in general. And I think for a program like Wisconsin, it's just, can you be in the conversation in the middle of November, when in previous years you were just on the outside looking in?
Yeah, again, I understand where he's coming from. Like, just, it's an example. He didn't actually say Alabama. He just said, Week 3. We all know what Week 3 is. And I obviously am looking way too much into that as opposed to what he actually meant by it. But yeah, I mean, it does make college football more interesting for a longer period of time. I heard over the weekend, I think it might have been Nick Saban when he was on College Game Day, he was talking about the NFL wishes every single team could go 8-8 and be, still in contention in week 16 or week 17 for the playoffs. That's what the NFL would love. And I think college football is kind of hoping that same thing, where you keep more teams and more fan bases interested for the entirety of the season.
There's a lot of other potential benefits to this too, which Luke mentioned. I also asked Mike Tressel a question about this earlier this preseason, but the idea of retaining players for a little bit longer, because what's ended up happening, you have these bowl games that nobody cares about. And if I'm a player and I'm trying to protect myself for the NFL, I'm out of there. But there's something meaningful on the line if you are a playoff team, even if you're the 12 seed, in a way that's not if you're playing in the Outback Bowl. There's a lot of extra layers and tentacles to what this means, but it keeps people hanging out there, hanging on to the dream a little bit longer. And I think that's a good thing for football. And I think the argument against it would be like, it's diluting the value of a lot of things, the regular season for starters, conference championships, but what it means to be a playoff team. And I can understand that to an extent. I also am on the other side. I would rather see a 12-team field just because there is more excitement. And if you get in, you have every right to be there and you can potentially win a national championship. College football has just become the same 4 teams every year, it's felt like, or maybe there's 6. And at least now it feels more like what the NCAA tournament is in basketball. There's an automatic qualifier. There's a non-power, the non-power 4 team. So it's more fun, and I'm looking forward to exactly how it unfolds.
But with the NCAA tournament, there's just so many more teams involved in it, so that I do think the regular season in college basketball has kind of been devalued, and it's pretty much just all about what happens in March because so many teams are involved in March. Like it's an expectation that you make it every year, at least at Wisconsin. It's an expectation that you make the NCAA tournament every year, and they're going to be expanding it. And so it's going to be even more of an expectation that you make it, as long as it's at 12. And I know they're going up with it, but like 16, I think 16 may be the limit to it. I don't know. I could be wrong about that, but it's still like an exclusive club of teams, I think, that make it, that it's not just, what, everybody makes it. That's not the case. And so I don't know that it'll devalue the regular season in college football as it has in college basketball. The one thing it will do is, like, Michigan and Ohio State, that game on the last day of the year or the last day of the season may not mean whether you're going to the Big Ten championship game or not, or whether you're going to the playoff or not. And in the last couple of years, that has, when it's the 14 playoff, it definitely has been like the deciding factor some years. So maybe that game doesn't hold the same relevance in terms of a national championship. I think both sides are still going to be very interested in the outcome, and it's still going to matter a ton for both of those teams. But I think there are a number of situations like that maybe it's not as important as it used to be, just because it doesn't mean whether you're going to make it and have a chance for a national title anymore.
The Big Ten is, given where we are, Big Ten and SEC is the two big boys now, you're going to have 3 teams and potentially even 4 into this college football playoff if you put yourself in that position, because you're going to play so many quality opponents that a loss isn't going to knock you out. So yeah, that's part of it. There are drawbacks to this as well, but I think there are more positives, and especially since we're a Wisconsin focused show, for the Badgers, I think this is tremendously beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, Wisconsin had opportunities to get into the 4-team playoff, right? But really only one opportunity. Truly playing for a playoff spot, and that was 2017. They weren't getting in 2016 if they won. They weren't getting in 2019 if they won. I'm talking about the conference title. 2014, they weren't getting in those years. 2017, they would have gotten in had they beaten Ohio State that year. But, I mean, this just obviously does open up more opportunities for teams like Wisconsin. All right, let's close with the college football coaching tiers. Your brethren at The Athletic, I believe, do this every year. And there were 2 coaches at tier 1. Luke Fickell was not. But Luke Fickell was in tier 2. And I believe that's in the same tier he was last year. And this is essentially coaches that have either gone to the playoff or been right there but haven't actually won a national title. I think that was kind of the reasoning behind it, which makes sense. He took Cincinnati to the playoff and then also went to another New Year's Six game. Is it still deserving for Luke Fickell to be in tier 2, do you think?
I will be honest. When I saw the tiers, I was a little bit surprised that he was in tier 2, because a decent chunk of this seems to be based in what has just happened. And so I think of like Steve Sarkisian at Texas. Now, he moved up a couple of tiers, but he just led Texas to the college football playoff, and that just happened. And so does that, should he be a tier below Luke Fickell? And even like Kirk Ferentz at Iowa, he's in tier 3. I realize Iowa has not been a playoff team, though back in 2015, they were pretty close. He's been around for 25 years. Should he be a tier lower than Luke? I mean, there's a lot of arguments to be made, but I do think that how long do you hang on to what happened at Cincinnati? While incredible, and again, the only group of 5 coach to do that in a 4-team field, Wisconsin still went 7-6 a year ago. I do think if there's a similar type of season, the tiers could shift, but it's also based on the totality of his career. And it's hard to argue with that, because what he did at Cincinnati won't be forgotten for a long time.
Right. So the top 2 coaches, the only coaches in tier 1 are Dabo Swinney and Kirby Smart. I think Dabo Swinney needs to have a good year this year. He has, I would say, of all the coaches, of all the programs, Clemson's the one program that has not necessarily evolved just with the transfer portal and everything, but he's still obviously a very good coach. Anybody in that other tier 2 that may have been a surprise, I think, Lance Leipold is a guy that at Kansas who hasn't necessarily won anything big, but to turn obviously what he did at UW Whitewater and then what he did at Buffalo, and now to turn around a morbid program that was Kansas, to get him up there, I think really speaks highly of who he is and what he's done in his career. Ryan Day's up there. Kalen DeBoer is in tier 2. Brian Kelly, Lincoln Riley, Kyle Whittingham, Mike Norvell, though maybe he should be knocked back down after Saturday's game over in Ireland. But I think tier 2 kind of makes sense for Luke Fickell. But you're right. If it's another 7-6 or here's a problem though. And this is something we've talked a lot about. It matters what 7-6 looks like. It matters what 8-5 looks like, because the schedule's so much different. And if they look a lot better than last year, they're more disciplined. They actually throw the ball around the way that we were expecting. They have some success offensively, and the defense kind of picks up and gets back to where they were before. Okay, great. But if it's an 8-5 or a 7-6 that looks like last year, then I think we have major concerns.
I would certainly agree with that.
All right. Sounds good. We'll be back on Thursday. We're going to talk a little bit more about Western Michigan and what we know about them. I know Jesse's done a really deep dive into exactly who they are and what they're going to be, right?
All the schemes, all the answers you're looking for.
Yeah, can't wait. Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach.
All right, there he is, Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Can.